One of the best, most effective, and certainly most ambitious voter registration drives in history is in high gear throughout this country right now, as 27 states close registration on October 6th. So this week, Grit TV, that's us, in partnership with Live from Main Street and the Media Consortium with the help of the Progressive Book Club, are bringing you a week of special programming on the challenges facing voters this year and what tools exist to help. We are going to start today in Ohio, where in 2004, voters faced all sorts of obstacles on Election Day, from long lines and a shortage of voting machines in some inner cities to unprocessed registrations sitting around in boxes and vote challenges based on unfounded allegations of fraud. In the end, Congress challenged the ratification of the presidential elections based on what happened in that state. Fast forward to today, and the problems haven't disappeared. Voter registration ends October 6th there, but this is Golden Week, during which Ohioans can register and vote on the very same day. Also this year, for the very first time, any Ohio resident can vote absentee without giving any kind of a reason. Republicans in Ohio don't like all of that, and they're in court claiming that all this early voting will encourage, you guessed it, fraud. They're also challenging existing registrations using some very dodgy tactics. For example, have you moved since you registered? Have you ever moved and failed to update your records? Well, that could be enough to get your registration canceled. So the saga continues as we head into another tight election with another fight in a critical swing state. Here to give us some historical context and to outline what voters can do to ensure that they get to cast a vote and that their vote gets counted as cast, we have joining us on Ohio via Skype, lawyer and award-winning journalist Bob Fitrakis. As an election protection attorney, Bob called the first public hearings to investigate voter suppression and election irregularities after the 2004 election, and he's the author most recently of How the GOP Stole America's 2004 Election and Is Rigging 2008. Hi, Bob. Glad to have you with us. Here in studio, I'm very happy to have Donita Judge, a member of the Advancement Project's Power and Democracy team, and that organization's lead attorney covering Ohio. In 2006, Donita successfully advocated for the rights of displaced citizens of New Orleans to vote in the first election after Katrina and to have a voice in rebuilding their city. And joining us by phone, Stephen Hightower. He is the state director of the Ohio League of Young Voters. Hi, Stephen.
Hello.
Very quickly, first to you, Bob, and then to Stephen, who I know has to get back to his work. You and I remember, Bob, election night 2004. I was on the radio. You were there in Ohio. We heard from people in Columbus who had stood in line for 11 hours to cast a vote. What do you think was the result of that situation then, and what are you scared of this time around?
Well, the key result is we now have enough machines in place that would have been good for the 2000 election. You recall, Laura, that they conducted the 2004 election with half of the machines necessary. They needed 5,000. They had about 2,800, and 125 of them were hidden. So on average, if you were black in the inner city of Columbus, you waited 3 to 7 hours to vote. At Kenyon, people waited 11 hours, as you noted. So we have enough machines in place for the 2000 election. The question with this record turnout, will we have enough machines, or more important, paper backup for the 2008 election? Right now, Secretary of State Bruner has allowed precincts to have 25% of the necessary paper ballots to back up the machines.
Let me come to you, Stephen. You've been involved in this campaign for several weeks now in Ohio. It must be getting into very high gear this week. What do you think you're going to see in terms of increased registration, and what are you worried about in the weeks ahead? Your top 3 list.
Well, it is, in fact, very high intensity. Tomorrow begins the first day of early voting. What we are most concerned about is that people know about the opportunity to vote early. That will allow us to decrease the lines, to catch any problems early, and to effectively get as many people out to vote.
How many people would you say are newly registered this election of those who'll be voting this coming November or before, how many will be doing it for the first time, do you reckon?
There's tens of thousands, probably close to 30,000 new voters who will be coming into the process for the first time this year.
Coming to you, Donita, I mean, that's an enormous number. Across the country, people are saying that you could have as many as 2/3 of all people voting, either voting for the first time or voting on new technology. It means we've really got to understand what we're up against. Is our system equipped in Ohio or nationally to deal with this big influx?
Well, I think that certainly we have to look at the resources that are being distributed to the different counties in Ohio, and certainly while we do have an opportunity to vote on paper machines and also vote on paper and also to vote on machines, I think we do have to be concerned that in those urban communities, whether or not we are guaranteeing that they have the same resources as some of the outlying areas. For instance, in Columbus, Ohio, of course, there are going to be more issues on the ballot, which means if there's more issues on the ballot in Columbus, Ohio, it's going to take you longer to vote. And if it's going to take you longer to vote, how have we distributed those machines so that we have equity when it comes to the voter having, the voters in the urban areas not having to stand in line 3 to 7 hours, and that we have recognized that that could basically disenfranchise voters. I also think we not only need to look at the amount of time that we spend voting, but how much time does it take for a poll worker to check in a voter? I mean, all of that time has to be calculated in. And then from there, once we have that type of scenario, and the idea that the Secretary of State has really indicated that she believes it's going to be at least an 80% turnout, whether we have the resources to meet that type of turnout, and I'm just not completely confident at this point.
Stephen Hightower, back to you. That's again more reason why this golden week of early voting is so important, and yet I'm hearing that the GOP have their problems with it. What's their complaint?
Their complaints are not grounded in logic, so you would probably have to ask them more closely. But what they're actually saying is that in order to be considered a qualified elector, that you've had to be registered for more than 30 days before you actually voted, which would mean that if I were to register to vote today, I wouldn't be able to cast an absentee ballot until 30 days from now, which would create an additional amount of chaos throughout the voter system. So their goal is to create chaos and disorder. While we are promoting the simplicity of early voting, and as a way to take pressure off of the system, they are creating an atmosphere in which voters find it complicated and under those circumstances will tend to stay away.
Bob, you've been you are very familiar with dealing with some of these folks in Ohio and some of these sorts of challenges. One of the complaints raised by the GOP who are challenging this golden week in court is that there is an increased likelihood of fraud. Have they found any fraud any place that's occurred because of this? Bob?
Well, over the last decade or so, there's been 4 cases, and almost all of them were accidental, or in one case, a couple voted absentee and in person. The voter fraud is really a red herring. It was deliberately created by the White House and Karl Rove in a very famous hearing that I was at, where the co-chair of the Bush-Cheney legal team, their chief counsel, a man named Mark Thor Hearn, alleged that the NAACP and Acorn were paying off people in crack to get them to register to vote. He failed to disclose that he was the co-counsel of Bush-Cheney re-election. And really, it was that story that took off, but there's virtually no evidence of voter fraud. There's been Lorraine Minnick's famous study is that it's really a handful of cases in the whole country. I think this tactic is to get to people to look at voter fraud. Illegal immigrants or undocumented aliens are not coming in and voting because they're afraid of being arrested. It gets it away from the more important issue of massive voter suppression, which is well documented.